Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Franza Women. The title of today's webinar is Embedding Domestic Abuse Standards in Homelessness Support, How Accreditation Can Enhance Domestic Abuse Support for Those Experiencing Multiple Disadvantage. My name is Dalma Fabian, and I'm coordinating Franza Women. In Franza Women, we are working to highlight the intersection of domestic abuse and homelessness. And we know that women experiencing domestic abuse or gender-based violence also face homelessness. And we hear from our members as well that the systems often struggle to respond to the needs of women in a coordinated and trauma-informed way. That is why today we focus on DAHA, which is the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and more specifically on the accreditation framework for homelessness services. DAHA offers a model to embed survivor-led standards into services and helps providers to better respond to gender-based violence. Yes, I don't want to go into the details of DAHA, but what we're going to explore is how the DAHA accreditation works in homelessness setting, and we'll hear from an organization, the Single Homelessness Project, on how they implemented DAHA. And it would be great to reflect on the opportunities and the challenges of adopting such a framework, maybe in other countries. So I would like to invite to all of you to think about what it would take in your organization to adopt a framework and ask questions and share reflections throughout the webinar. And if you have similar accreditation or framework in your countries, please do share them with us. So over the next hour, we will hear from our great speakers. You can see them on your screen, and I invite them to introduce themselves and say a few words before we launch the presentations.
Thanks, Dalma. Shall I start? So my name's Lucy Campbell. It's really lovely to be here at this webinar this morning. So I work for a homelessness organisation based in London, England, which Dalma mentioned. And we've been one of the first homelessness organisations to undertake this DAHA accreditation. So I'm going to be talking about our journey a little bit later on after you've heard from Elise and Amy. But now I'm just going to pass you over to my colleague Ava to introduce herself.
Hello everyone, my name is Ava and I work with Lucy at Single Homeless Project in London. I work as a women specialist navigator. However, alongside that, I also work as a domestic abuse partnership lead. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But I'll pass over to Amy and Elise now.
Thanks, Ava. Good morning, everybody. My name's Amy Smith. I am the accreditation manager at the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance. So it's myself and Elise and our team who have been working on developing the accreditation over the past few years in collaboration with organisations like SHP to make sure this accreditation is available and fit for purpose for the homelessness sector. So yeah, we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in the presentation, but I'll pass over to Elise.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Elise and I'm the accreditation lead for our DAHA project. So I mainly work with our organisations to support them through the framework. But as my other colleagues have said, we'll speak a little bit more about that. I'm just going to share my
Excellent.
screen.
Thank you for the introduction. As I said, after the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So I encourage you to ask your questions in the question and answer box, or in the chat box, or share reflections. Great. Let's begin. So the floor is yours, Alice.
Thank you. Just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, great. So yeah, obviously today's webinar will be talking about how to embed our standards around domestic abuse in homelessness organisations, and how we can enhance domestic abuse support for those experiencing multiple disadvantage. So the webinar today will explore how embedding our framework can strengthen homelessness services and improve responses for survivors of domestic abuse, discuss why the accreditation was established, what it covers, and how such standards can be implemented across homelessness services in Europe. We'll spotlight single homelessness project's process of becoming our first ever DAHA accredited organisation, and share some practical insights, challenges and successes from integrated domestic abuse focused approaches within frontline homelessness work. So you'll hear us use the phrase multiple disadvantage quite a lot throughout this presentation. So it's useful to go over our definition of this. So by multiple disadvantage, we are referring to those with co-occurring experiences of homelessness, substance misuse, interpersonal violence and abuse, and poor mental health. We recognise that multiple disadvantage is a systemic and not an individual issue. Structural inequality creates the conditions in which experiences of poverty, abuse, trauma and neglect intersect. In addition, we recognise that disadvantage is further compounded by systemic discrimination based on concepts of identity such as age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, religion, or belief. So when we're talking about multiple disadvantage, we're referring to more than a list of challenges. We're talking about the way systems and inequalities interact to make those challenges harder to escape. So for example, multiple disadvantage might look like a domestic abuse survivor who's obviously experienced abuse and VOG. They may develop anxiety or PTSD, turning to substances and potentially losing their home. We know that each issue is connected, but they're also shaped by structural inequality. So thinking about poverty, gender-based violence, racism, discrimination, and social exclusion. So again, when thinking about multiple disadvantage, we're not thinking just about supporting individuals. It's about addressing the systems that keep our service users on the margins. And that means looking very honestly at how our services, our policies and attitudes either build trust or reinforce fear in seeking support. So in the UK, we have seen a real shift in recent years towards domestic abuse becoming a priority through policy and research. So you may be aware that in 2021, the Domestic Abuse Act, gave us the first legal definition of domestic abuse that went beyond just physical violence, but also encompassed other types of abuse, including coercive control, emotional and economic abuse, as well as other forms of abuse. The Act also highlights how local authorities should be supporting survivors of domestic abuse into priority housing and what safe accommodation needs to be offered. In the UK, one example of safe accommodation is sort of refuge provisions. There's also some upcoming changes that we will be welcoming to better regulate supported housing services. So we believe these changes will also improve domestic abuse awareness in these services. Whilst, of course, we really support these changes and it's a good step in the right direction, there is still a huge gap in provision for those who are experiencing domestic abuse and multiple disadvantage. A lot of women in these scenarios are sort of not able to access refuges and aren't always provided with alternative safe options. We see a lot of these survivors being placed in hostels that are usually mixed gender, and there is no current obligation for these organisations to know how to respond to domestic abuse, let alone how to sort of identify it as well. We've also seen an increase in research into gender and how it intersects with multiple disadvantage. We know that women experience multiple disadvantage very differently to men, and experiences of multiple disadvantage for women often include experiences of interpersonal violence and abuse. Almost all studies in the last sort of 30 years have shown that almost all women experiencing homelessness are experiencing domestic abuse or some form of VAUG, which is violence against women and girls. So despite there not being legislation in the UK for homelessness services to know how to respond to domestic abuse, the research shows how important it is for organisations in the homelessness world to know how to respond to domestic abuse. And that is where our work comes in. So now we'll just talk a little bit about what our accreditation is and why it was developed. So the accreditation was designed specifically for the sector and by the sector. We developed the framework in conjunction with a number of homelessness providers, including Single Homelessness Project, who will be speaking a little bit later. But we also used our expertise from supporting survivors experiencing multiple disadvantage on the front line. We recognised that homelessness services needed a different approach to tackling domestic abuse that really looked through a multiple disadvantage lens. Our framework also recognises that there are key differences in domestic abuse where there is homelessness and other forms of multiple disadvantage present. For example, we really focus on working with perpetrators and supporting organisations with working with couples, as we know that often both people in a couple will be using homelessness services. So throughout our framework, we ensure that homelessness providers know how to do this safely and without colluding with perpetrators. The accreditation also takes into consideration that women experiencing domestic abuse will have increased barriers to accessing services or even being able to maintain their use of services. So, for example, we've worked with a lot of survivors who have lost sort of bed spaces in hostels due to their perpetrator coercing them to sleep on the street with them. So essentially, our accreditation really highlights the key differences in domestic abuse where there is homelessness and multiple disadvantage present. Just going to hand over to Amy now.
Thanks, Elise. So I'm going to take you through a few slides outlining kind of the ins and outs of our accreditation, so what we cover when we work with organisations, and a few insights into the into the journey that we've had over the past few years in developing this piece of work. So to start with, in terms of our accreditation framework and what we look at and what we make sure is in place before we accredit organisations, is these things that you can see on your screen now. So our framework covers 3 broad sections that are in the left-hand diagram. So we break the framework down into infrastructure, coordination and response. So our infrastructure work, which is in the orange circles, is essentially all of the core foundational pieces of work that we do with an organisation. So we look at things like their strategies and policies, particularly around domestic abuse. So making sure that there is a domestic abuse strategy in place across the organisation. So they're thinking about how they are going to implement and embed domestic abuse related practice now and in the months and years to come. We also look at their domestic abuse policies and procedures. So that's for both staff and for service users. So what they will do when they identify domestic abuse and how they will respond to it. We make sure there's a really clear distinction between what that looks like for staff and for service users. So we are thinking about those who are accessing the services, but also acknowledging that a lot of frontline professionals across the homelessness sector may also have lived experience of domestic abuse, and they may need support whilst they are in their employment as well. So we make sure that they're able to access the right support that they might need at any point. We also think about staff development and support, so things like staff training, so making sure that everyone across the organisation has a basic understanding and awareness of domestic abuse and what domestic abuse might look like for survivors who are experiencing multiple disadvantage. We also look at enhanced knowledge for different people in the organisation as well, so those who it might be relevant for their roles. So for example, Lucy and Ava in their roles would need an enhanced knowledge of domestic abuse, which they have. In Single Homeless Project, so we would make sure that there was also an enhanced offer as well, so they can also support their colleagues where domestic abuse cases might come up, to make sure that there is the strong knowledge there to safely respond to domestic abuse. And we also look at monitoring and recording as well. So we look at how case notes are written around domestic abuse. So for service users who are experiencing domestic abuse or perpetrating domestic abuse, what notes are written about these experiences, what language is used, making sure that language isn't victim blaming, and making sure that there's action being taken when domestic abuse is identified, and making sure that information is also shared in a safe way as well. So we look at all of those different sorts of things to make sure that when domestic abuse is identified, there is also something being done about it, and it's not just being left in like a folder on a case management system. The second section in the framework is our coordination section, so the green circles, and that is all about communications. So internal and external communications, how organisations are talking about domestic abuse, what information they're sharing. So thinking about how they're talking about domestic abuse with their staff, but also how they're sharing information about domestic abuse and their domestic abuse response with their service users as well. So making sure that that information is accessible for everyone who might need it. So obviously making sure policy documents are accessible, easy to read, but also thinking about maybe posters in services like hostels, so the information is readily available for people who might need it. And then we also look at how the organisation is communicating about domestic abuse externally. So what's very common across the sector is the use of social media now, so things like LinkedIn and other social media platforms being used for organisations and services to promote their work. And we do encourage organisations to ensure they are thinking about how they are discussing and talking about domestic abuse using those kind of external communication platforms, as well as thinking about their partnerships in different external meetings, so different maybe safeguarding mechanisms and structures that happen in local areas. Thinking about how they are engaged with specialist domestic abuse services, so the providers of the like refuge provision and domestic abuse outreach support in their area. So making sure that they're forming partnerships with key specialist organisations. One thing that we're really keen to promote in our framework is what we call the Coordinated Community Response, or the CCR. So making sure that every organisation and sector, so the domestic abuse sector, homelessness, healthcare, social care, and so on, they are all aware of their responsibility when it comes to responding to domestic abuse. So that's a really key part of the partnership work that we encourage our providers to do. So they know their responsibilities around domestic abuse, but they know that also it's not on their shoulders entirely, and they are part of a wider network of professionals who are also chipping in to respond safely and effectively to domestic abuse. And then the final section, which is the purple circles, is our response section. So this is thinking about how we are actually responding to survivors who are in the services. So thinking about what support that we give them, making sure it is led by them and what they want. Making sure that we are managing risk safely and effectively for both survivors in services, but also making sure we're not colluding with perpetrators or increasing risk when we have perpetrators in services as well. So obviously our standard safeguarding mechanisms, making sure they're being utilised, but also recognising where maybe standard risk assessment practices might not work as effectively for survivors who are experiencing multiple disadvantage, and making sure that we are considering all the experiences of multiple disadvantage, how they can impact risk and impact experience of domestic abuse as well. We also look at physical environments, so we go and visit some of the services in the organisations that we're accrediting to make sure that they're safe, they're welcoming, making sure that there are safe spaces for confidential conversations to take place between frontline workers and the service users, and just making sure that they're safe spaces as much as they can be. And the final one is all around perpetrator management. As Elise has already mentioned, it's very common to see perpetrators as well as survivors accessing homelessness services. So we do make sure to support staff across the organisations we work with to safely work with perpetrators, and also safely work with couples where the victim, survivor and the perpetrator are remaining in a relationship, and making sure that the support is getting to those individuals who may otherwise be overlooked by services. So that's another really key point really of our framework as well. Can I have the next slide please, Elise? Thank you. So in terms of how embedding this framework can strengthen homelessness services response to survivors, these are the kind of key 4 things really that the accreditation will do. So first and foremost, and most importantly, it will save lives. Acknowledging domestic abuse and safely and effectively responding to domestic abuse will ensure survivors are supported. As we've said already, survivors of domestic abuse are very often overlooked in homelessness services, or domestic abuse might not be seen as a priority. So simply by recognising domestic abuse and knowing how to respond to it will save lives. It will reduce the risk of high harm and homicide, which of course is crucial, and a really, really important part of the work that we do. The DAHA accreditation will also enhance collaboration, as I mentioned about the coordinated community response. So helping organisations to recognise their responsibility in responding to domestic abuse, but also recognising it's not all on one organisation to solve absolutely everything, or every domestic abuse related concern in a survivor's life, and making sure that people are collaborating and getting all the important professionals around the table to effectively support a survivor. DAHA will also improve staff safety and well-being, and this is a really strong focus in our accreditation. So we know that a lot of professionals across the homelessness sector might have lived experience of domestic abuse, and we want to avoid vicarious trauma that they may be at risk of experiencing when supporting survivors. So it's really important that we ensure that staff are looked after and well supported in their organisations. So we require organisations to demonstrate how they are supporting their staff when they are completing this accreditation. So for example, through clinical supervisions or one-to-one sessions with their line manager, group reflective practice sessions, or other employee assistance programs that might be available to them. And this is something that we, as I say, have a really strong focus on, and we believe is really important, because obviously we need to make sure that service users are appropriately supported, but they can't be supported effectively if staff aren't well, or staff aren't in a position to safely support them. So we need to make sure we're looking after the staff teams as well as the survivors and the service users. And finally, the DAHA accreditation will improve how you respond to domestic abuse and multiple disadvantage. So one of the key thing really about this accreditation is that we don't focus on domestic abuse in a generic way. Everything we do focuses on how domestic abuse response needs to be different for survivors experiencing multiple disadvantage. So thinking about how substance use, how experiences of homelessness, how mental health diagnosis all intersect with experience of domestic abuse, and what support needs to look different for survivors who have those experiences. And we encourage services to think about how they need to adapt their practice. Do they need to be more flexible in terms of how they support their service users? Do they need to be more assertive in their outreach provision and going to survivors rather than expecting survivors to come to them? Not relying on things like phone support, because we know that a lot of survivors who are homeless might not have access to a phone safely, and things like that. So making sure that providers are thinking flexibly and are adapting their practice to meet the needs of all the survivors in their services, rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach. Can I have the next slide, please, Elise? Thank you. And in the final few slides from me, I'm just going to talk about a few successes and challenges and insights that we've learnt along the way in our work developing this accreditation. So starting positively with the successes, we have noticed as we've moved through this process an increase in sign-ups, which of course is really positive. We want as many organisations signed up as possible. And that is thanks to the issue of women's homelessness, multiple disadvantage and domestic abuse being more widely talked about across the homelessness sector across England at the moment. And that's thanks to different pieces of work that are happening across the country, like the Women's Rough Sleeping Census that Lucy fronts across from SHP across the country, which is really, really valuable in terms of knowing how many women are experiencing homelessness and how many women are out there and who do need our support. As well as increase in conversations across the sector around the importance of homelessness and how experiences are gendered, as well as obviously recognising that domestic abuse and homelessness are very closely linked issues. So it's really positive we're seeing an increase in sign-ups because of all of this wider work that's happening. Another success we've had is our focus on staff. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we focus on making sure that we are supporting staff effectively throughout this accreditation, as well as service users. And staff have fed back to us during the assessment process of this accreditation how they appreciate the focus on staff support, where other accreditation frameworks maybe don't consider that as much, and just focus on service users. So that is a really great success for us and something that we're really proud to have in our accreditation. Another success is the consistency in domestic abuse response across the organisations who signed up. So we cover whole organisations and with this accreditation work, and some organisations work across really large areas and have lots and lots of services. So for example, our national homelessness charities and organisations across England will have hundreds of services and employ thousands of staff. And it's very easy for there to be a bit of a postcode lottery and different the standard of practice around domestic abuse response to be different in each area. So what this accreditation has done, it's made sure there's consistency across whole organisations, so that any survivor who is accessing support anywhere across an organisation is going to get the same safe and effective response, which is really, really important. And a few challenges that we have identified in this accreditation process or development process. Firstly is financial strain, and I'm sure this isn't just us experiencing this at all. But in the UK, we are very often reliant on short-term funding contracts. So we operate, a lot of services operate year to year. They won't know 1 year to the next whether their funding's going to continue, which leads to problems with staff retention, staff leaving because they can't be offered permanent contracts. But also the contracts not being very flexible and allowing for work like undertaking an accreditation like this to take place. So it can make things like this quite tricky to manage and complete. The lack of government policy. So Elise mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. There are upcoming policy changes that we will absolutely welcome when we get them. But as it stands at the moment, we haven't got a homelessness or a violence against women and girls strategy, a cross-government strategy across England. And this makes it very tricky for us to influence in this area. And obviously we hope that homelessness, multiple disadvantage, domestic abuse are considered all together in these strategies. So this will help us to kind of push forward with the influencing in this area to make sure that we are able to roll out this important work across services all across the country. Domestic abuse is not being seen as a priority in homelessness services is another challenge that we see as well. And again, because there's no government policy at the moment in this area, sadly, it means that domestic abuse isn't always seen as a priority or as something that homelessness organisations should consider. The positive is that there are organisations out there like SHP who do see that the value and the importance in having an effective domestic abuse response across their services. We are relying on organisations to want to do this work right now, which is positive because it means that the organisations who are signing up recognise the value and want to do it, which is obviously really great. But it does make it tricky where we are speaking to some services who maybe don't realise how many survivors of domestic abuse are in their services and who do need their help. Where they're not recognised, it can make it quite tricky. And sadly, they're going to be left without that support until we have some government influence and policy kind of influence kind of helping to push this work along. Next slide, please, Elise. And just some insights into into some kind of key important things really that are important to consider if you are thinking about developing a framework or model for your organisations or in your areas. Some key things to be aware of that we have recognised. So the first being the capacity of frontline organisations. So as I kind of said with the funding kind of landscape across England at the moment and the short-term contracts, there's also not much money sometimes in these contracts. So it means that frontline homelessness organisations are doing a lot of work for very little. And there's often not time for additional projects like accreditation work to take place, as well as priorities kind of constantly changing, which makes it difficult to commit to big pieces of work like an accreditation. So that's something that's important to be aware of. Another thing is the geographical spread of membership, and this is a positive that we have, a positive insight that we've noticed in our work in the past year or so. And as I said before, bigger organisations that we're working with have seen a noticeable improvement in the consistency of the domestic abuse response across their organisation, thanks to their DAHA accreditation work. And equally, we are also seeing a broader geographical spread of organisations signing up. So we originally started this work in London, but we're also seeing organisations up in the Midlands and the north of England signing up, as well as also down in the south of England as well, which is really important. And the final insight is that this process takes time. It's not an easy one. It's quite a long piece of work for organisations to undertake, which I'm sure Lucy and Ava will talk about in their presentation. This is a piece of work that includes a whole shift in an organisation's culture. And it's really important that it's led by a few people with the understanding of domestic abuse and homelessness and with the passion for that work as well, who can really spearhead that that piece of work for a whole organisation. It takes time and it isn't easy, but it's definitely something that is worth doing. Next slide, please, Elise. Thank you. So these are just a few tips really in terms of implementation across Europe. So the first one is to be aware of the infrastructure of the organisations you're working with. So making sure that you are starting with ensuring that domestic abuse policies and procedures are in place, and making sure that organisations have a domestic abuse strategy to hold them accountable for the work in the months and years to come is really, really important. Making sure that you're being survivor-led. So make sure survivor voice is at the heart of all of your work. Listen to what they need and want from you and make sure that you do it wherever you can. It's really important that this work makes sense for them and works for them and meets what they're currently missing in their support. Also as well, make sure that you're working with homelessness organisations. In our team, we ensure that all of us have come from frontline backgrounds, so we all have experience in the domestic abuse or homelessness sector. But it's also important that when you're developing accreditations and models like this, that you're working with the frontline sector, the homelessness sector, and listen to what they feel the challenges are right now and what they need, and also what's going to work for them, and work with them to develop your frameworks, and find out what does and doesn't work together. This is what we did with our accreditation with organisations like SHP, and we definitely couldn't have done it without them. So making sure that it's a collaborative approach is really, really important, because otherwise it just won't work. Assess need across organisations, areas and services. So conducting needs assessments and finding out how many women, for example, are in your hostel accommodation in your area, or who are rough sleeping. Finding out what the need is in your area for this is really, really important place to start. It proves that services like this are needed and models like this are needed, and it will make it a bit more straightforward, hopefully, when it comes to speaking to commissioners or funders who might be helping to fund pieces of work like this, if you're able to evidence what the need is in your area. Making sure that you're a part of a coordinated community response, so partnership working and making sure that you're working together to develop pieces of work like this, of course, is really important. And finally, using professional curiosity and focusing on multiple disadvantage. As I said before, being generic with the domestic abuse response across homelessness services doesn't work. You need to think about how multiple disadvantage impacts on domestic abuse, and how these experience impact on what a survivor might need. So we need to make sure that we're thinking very flexibly and making sure that you are considering how domestic abuse support needs to look different for this group of survivors in order for a piece of work like this to work effectively. And the final slide, please, Elise, from me. So this is just an opportunity to find out more about our work. Thank you so much for listening to our part of the presentation. If you do have any questions or want to contact us, please do so. Our email is on the screen, and there are a couple of QR codes there as well for you to find out a little bit more about our accreditation work, but also the training that we offer frontline professionals as well. We do have an evaluation of our DAHA project that is in the works at the moment, and we anticipate our evaluation report will be coming out in April of next year. So if anyone is interested in keeping an eye out for that, please do. And if you are interested in finding out a bit more about how to create a model like this for your area, please do get in touch with us. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to Lucy.
Great, thanks very much, Amy. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, have those come up? One of the panelists can just give me a shout.
Yeah, they're all good.
Good.
Thank you. So, as I said, my name's Lucy Campbell and I work for a homelessness charity in London called Single Homeless Project. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about how we've been able to implement and embed the standards that Amy and Lise spoke about as part of our journey to achieve this accreditation. So just to talk briefly about who we are at Single Homeless Project. So we, as I said, we work across the whole of London. We're a fairly kind of medium-sized to big charity. So we've got over 800 employees. We work across all of the London boroughs, so 33 London boroughs. And we have a real range of services. So we have hostels and supported accommodation. We also deliver housing first services. We have some specialist women's only hostels as well. And we also work with young people experiencing mental ill health. And yeah, lots of kind of a real broad range of projects that we deliver at SHP. And we've been working in London for 50 years now. So just to talk briefly about why we decided to really invest in this opportunity and spend time working towards improving our domestic abuse response using the DAHA framework. So back in 2021, we did a piece of research looking at women's homelessness in London. We worked with experts from the University of York, so Dr. Joanne Brotherton and Professor Nicholas Pleece. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with their work in Europe around women's homelessness. And we looked at the experiences of around 200 women in one area of London. And actually, we weren't particularly looking to investigate their experiences of domestic abuse and homelessness. We were focused on other things. But what came through so strongly in that piece of research was that, as it says on the slide, domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence are near universal experiences for women who experience homelessness. So as an organisation, that really was a bit of a call to action just to understand how prevalent this was for the women that were using our services. And as the report recommended there, the intersection of domestic abuse and homelessness, particularly as a cause of women's homelessness, needs to be fully recognised. So for us as an organisation delivering homelessness services, we didn't have a particular kind of specialism or focus around domestic abuse at that time, but this really was a call to action to realise actually we really need to improve in this area if we're going to be providing support properly to especially the women, but not all women obviously are survivors, to the people who are using our services. And certainly from a personal perspective, I've been working in frontline services for almost 20 years now, and I don't think I've ever supported a woman experiencing homelessness that hasn't also experienced some form of gender-based violence as well. Just to illustrate that point, I'm going to play a short film now, which captures the voices and the experiences of some of the women who take part in our annual research project, which is called the Women's Rough Sleeping Census. So again, this is a short survey that we ask women in England every year in September, and we actually don't ask about domestic abuse or gender-based violence. We just ask about their experiences of homelessness. But there's a free text box at the end of the survey, and so many hundreds of women choose to share with us their experiences relating to domestic abuse and gender-based violence. So I just want to share their voices and their experiences with you today to, I suppose, really illustrate how important this issue is and why we're doing this work. I hope you can hear it. If you can't hear it, just kind of turn your mic on and let me know.
I was groomed when living with a stranger. My mental health is so bad, and at times I am suicidal. I feel worthless and have lost all my self-esteem. I'm crying out for help and no one is helping me.
I feel vulnerable. You have to rely on people who you can't trust and don't feel safe with. I have to put myself at risk and do things I don't want to so I can get shelter for the night.
Rough sleeping is very scary as a woman alone. You don't sleep well as you're in fear, and if you find a group to sleep rough with, as a woman you have to offer something for safety, share what you have, money, drugs or sex.
I have to pay for my storage and spend most days awake in McDonald's. I can't get a job as I'm homeless.
Fear at nighttime eats away at you. You're more at risk as a woman.
I feel vulnerable when I have arguments with my partner. Sometimes I have to stay at a friend's or in a tent in the back garden because he has kicked me out in the early hours of the morning.
Rough sleeping and being a trans woman is probably the worst possible combination. What is already a very challenging situation soon turns to a different level of endless abuse.
I don't know where to go without phone credit or internet. I feel uncomfortable talking to other rough sleepers, but they are where you hear about support.
To keep safe for a woman is more difficult. I've been raped by people while sleeping in a bank doorway. I now ensure I'm with a male rough sleeper at all times. I believe it's the safest option, but it doesn't mean I'm safe.
One of the bad symptoms of being on the street is that your mind and memory becomes reduced because you're forced to think about basic things, basic needs, carrying your things, where you'll go to the toilet, where you'll sleep, how you'll eat. You feel like you don't exist anymore. It makes you burst into tears, but you're still expected to do everything as normal. Go to the job centre, etc.
I have experienced homelessness on and off for 30 years, and the system has failed me over and over.
I recently started to stay with a male friend as I have nowhere else to go. He sometimes doesn't let me back in. I slept in the garden last night.
It's not safe, and I can't be outside at night.
So yeah, I think that film and those women's voices just really illustrate kind of the importance of why we undertook this accreditation and how we really have to think differently about women who experience homelessness and abuse at the same time and need that different response. So I just want to share a few things that we've done at Single Homeless Project, which have really informed our journey and enabled us to undertake this accreditation and meet those 10 standards that Amy and Elise covered. One of the first things that we did was to establish an organisational steering group, thinking about membership from all areas of the organisation. So as they've said, it's not just a accreditation for frontline services. We also had buy-in from our human resources team, our learning and development team, our communications team, etc. Because this is thinking about how domestic abuse is responded to in all areas of the organisation. So to have that kind of membership was really, really important to us and really helped us on our journey. Had a really great example of this recently with our finance team actually raising an issue with me whereby a staff member had been experiencing domestic abuse and the perpetrator had tried to intercept how she was being paid, for example. So I think that's just one example of how it's so important not just to think about how we provide domestic abuse services and support to the clients or service users, but also how we support our staff. That really kind of brings me on to my next point. So one of the first things that we did at Single Homeless Project was to conduct an all staff survey, really just to understand kind of where people were when it came to domestic abuse, how confident people were in responding. But also as part of that survey, we identified that actually 40% of staff that worked at Single Homeless Project had themselves experienced domestic abuse. So they had that lived experience. And I think that's a really, really big proportion of staff. So that was important learning for us. And one of the first things that we did as a result was to create a standalone policy and procedure for how we as an organisation support staff who might be affected. We created an organisational lead, which is a role that I do alongside my other responsibilities. And as Amy said, that's been really fundamental to make sure that the work can be driven forward, because what we know about homelessness services and charities and organisations is, we're always busy, we're always overstretched, we don't have much money. So making sure there's a clear responsibility was really important. We reviewed our policies and procedures. We reviewed them with the support of people who used our services and also with expert support from the domestic abuse and violence against women sectors to make sure that they were really as strong as they could be. And as I mentioned, we created one for staff as well. Something that we did to help staff working for our organisation was to create a support panel where every 2 months, any staff across the whole organisation can come and have a safe, confidential space to discuss any challenges or issues that they're having related to domestic abuse or gender-based violence, and get some specialist support from a panel of experts. So that's been a really nice way to make sure that staff, you know, who maybe haven't had time to go on training recently or are just really struggling with a complex situation, can always have that safe space to go to get that additional advice and support. It's really important to try and build a network of people that are doing this across the organisation. You know, we're a big organisation. We operate across a huge city. We've got all different kinds of services. There's no way that just 1 or 2 people can be kind of doing that work for the whole organisation. So what we did was to create a network of domestic abuse partnership leads. And we've got Ava, one of our partnership leads, who's going to talk to you in a minute about how she's found that role and some of the work that she does. But they're people that undertake this role alongside their normal responsibilities because they are passionate about improving our response to domestic abuse. Amy mentioned as part of the accreditation, they come out and visit our physical environments. And we wanted to make sure our physical environments were as safe as possible. And that's not always easy because at SHP, we don't own our buildings. We rent, I think, all of them actually. So we can't be making kind of huge structural changes. But what we did do was we made a checklist about how an environment might feel to someone who's experienced domestic abuse when they come into it. So thinking about security measures, thinking about safety, confidentiality, all of those kind of things, and how that might be viewed through the eyes of a survivor coming in. And now we can check all of our buildings using that assessment, and we can make changes wherever we possibly can. We've improved our training offer as well, so all staff in the organisation can get a level of domestic abuse related training that's kind of, you know, fitted to their needs. Obviously, if you work in the finance team, you might not need as much training as someone working in a women's only service, but everybody has a training offer because, as I said, this is about all of us. You know, domestic abuse is everybody's business at our organisation, not just those in frontline roles. And I don't have time to go into them now, but we've developed a number of partnership projects, working really closely with other organisations, because this is never about just thinking about what we do internally as an organisation. We know that the best work happens, as Amy and Elise have mentioned, as part of a coordinated community response. So thinking about who we can work with, thinking about working with domestic abuse specialist organisations to really kind of create guidance and training and pilot new ways of working to address gaps, because actually for survivors who experience multiple disadvantage, we don't have a lot of specialist services that are kind of created just for them. So we've built some, we're doing some things which are quite new and exciting, and I'll touch on a couple in a minute if I get time. Just to pull out a few quotes and talk about the impact that doing this accreditation has had for the people that we support. So one client said, after so many years of bad experiences at homeless hostels, I didn't believe in the system anymore. When I came to Single Homeless Project, I felt like my support workers saw me as a person. They saw what was happening then and there, not just my history. When I lost my temper, they talked to me and reassured me they were on my side, and I grew to trust them. Now the wheels are in motion for me to move into my own place, and I'm looking forward to having my own front door. So I think that's really important, because I think running through all of those standards is the survivor voice and the survivor experience, and really practically making sure that our responses are gender informed and trauma informed. And that means, you know, working with people through so-called challenging behaviour, through their trauma responses, sticking by their side, and that's really what this is all about. Another client said, I'm now living in a home with only women. I finally feel safe. And because I feel safe, I have more energy. I'm open to doing more things, and I'm not looking over my shoulder all the time. So again, thinking about our women's only spaces, thinking about how we can make sure those are truly gender informed. You know, you can't have a women's only space, but then have, you know, male security guards at night, for example. You can't have a women's only space, but then not think about women's cultural and intersectional needs, for example. So making our spaces as welcoming and safe as possible for women. And just a few quotes from clients, from our staff as well, and how they felt the impact of this. I won't read them through all now, but one worker said, "My client's words were, I feel like I can breathe again. I feel safe and I have a place I can call my own. It's days like this that show me how important it is to be a domestic abuse lead and to continue to make a difference to make survivors feel safe and stop domestic abuse." And another staff member said, "DAHA is important because it makes sure people experiencing domestic abuse aren't overlooked, even when they have other challenges going on. It creates a consistent approach for my teams and across the whole charity, so people get the same safe and supportive response wherever they turn." So we're short of time. I'm not going to talk about innovating to meet needs today, but if any of you on the call would like to know more about some of the innovation work that we've done as part of this, the Women's Rough Sleeping Census, guidance for working with perpetrators, and also we're currently piloting a housing first for couples where there's known or suspected domestic abuse and where the survivor wants to be housed with the partner. These are all really interesting projects which we're working on at the moment. We've got lots of research to share, so do just drop me an email if you'd like to know more. In a minute, I'm going to hand you over to Ava to kind of really give that frontline perspective on how it's been being a domestic abuse partnership lead. So as I said, this is a network of people we have across the organisation. It's a completely voluntary position. It's just people who want to do this alongside their other duties and responsibilities because they are passionate about improving our response to domestic abuse. And it's a very kind of flexible role. People can kind of do whatever they want really in this space as long as it's related to domestic abuse. But a big part of it is building and maintaining partnerships with local domestic abuse specialist services and just kind of staying up to date with organisational or local or national change and information, sharing that with our clients, sharing that with other staff, and really being that kind of go-to person, that expert in domestic abuse for the organisation. So I'm going to hand you over to Ava now, who can talk a little bit more about how that experience has been for her. Thanks, Ava.
Thank you, Lucy, and hello everyone. It's lovely to be able to speak here today. So my name is Ava, and I'm one of the women's specialist navigators at Single Homeless Project. As a navigator, I provide trauma-informed support to women experiencing homelessness and multiple disadvantage. My role in particular is an outreach role, so I often meet women when they are rough sleeping or at the start of their housing journey, also women experiencing hidden homelessness. My role involves coordinating support across a range of services for the women, advocating for and alongside the women that I support, and empowering them to get the help and access to services that they need. I also have the great privilege of working as a domestic abuse partnership lead in SHP and promoting the DAHA accreditation and ensuring that our services and teams are safe, consistent and empowering for survivors of domestic abuse. Working as a partnership lead, I get to work alongside incredibly passionate fellow leads who all come from a variety of teams and different services, and who all bring unique perspectives to the lead role. Some leads work on outreach teams like myself, or some are in accommodation-based services like hostels. Some are also in some of the young people services. So it's great to have that variety there. It's very inspiring hearing about the amazing work that's happening across SHP and the important conversations that are being had within different teams. We meet on a quarterly basis, and we share what we've been up to over the last 3 months, sharing kind of new ideas, new projects that are happening. So in one of our most recent meetings, some of the leads spoke about how they're creating posters to hang up around their services. Others spoke about setting up different workshops. I know there's one lead who is setting up a consent workshop. She works in one of the young people's services. Others are looking at the policies that they have within their services, and just kind of having those conversations within their teams, just about the DAHA accreditation, and ensuring that they're all being embedded in kind of everything that we do. But yeah, each lead is working in their own way to ensure survivor safety, accountability, and trauma-informed practice, and ensuring that they are all at the heart and centre of everything that we do. As a navigator, I often first meet with women at their most vulnerable point, often when they're rough sleeping and just at the start of their housing journey. Many of the women I meet with, they're bedded down with males, and maybe in domestic abuse relationships. At that point, safety-led and survivor-led support are absolutely crucial. On my team in particular as well, we often work with couples. So in many cases, I might support the survivor, while a colleague of mine is supporting the perpetrator. This kind of collaboration is essential for safety planning and perpetrator accountability, while also providing survivor-led support, where we address those behaviours that are causing harm. Recently, for example, I supported a woman who had been rough sleeping with her partner for several months, through coordinated working between myself, housing teams in the local authority, support workers from other services as well, in each individual support network. We were able to put a safety plan in place that supported both the survivor and the perpetrator in their own way, and ensured that they both were able to get accommodation simultaneously or at the same time. This joint approach meant that that the survivor didn't have to navigate those risks alone, and that she had a whole network around her. And this is really what DAHA looks like in practice, being trauma-informed and survivor-led, and ensuring that the safety and the well-being of the survivor is the top priority. So just to close, for me, working under the DAHA accreditation is all about fostering an organisational culture that is empowering, that is committed to ensuring that every interaction with the survivor is respectful, empowering, and safe. And being part of this journey within SHP, and seeing the services become more consistent and confident in responding to domestic abuse has been incredibly rewarding, and yeah, it's just such an amazing thing to be a part of. But yes, that's all from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elise, for sharing a bit more about your journey and your experience. And that's all from us at Single Homeless Project. And I think just to close, one thing I'd say is thinking about resources that it takes to do this. So actually, as an organisation, we have no budget to do the DAHA accreditation. We've actually managed to make it work and kind of implement the things that we had within the existing staff resources that we had in the organisation. And as I said, starting off with a group of people that are so passionate and want to do this, and then kind of bringing everyone alongside us. So what I'd say to anyone on the call that's thinking about maybe doing something similar or trying to build a network in your organisation of domestic abuse leads or anything else that we've talked about today, if you don't have a budget, you can still do something, and it's still so important just to make the steps that you can, even if you don't have additional money, because as we know, and I'm sure it's the same in the countries that you're joining us from today, there's not much money around, but we can still make a great difference with the resources that we have within our organisations, because there's always like-minded and passionate people to work within the homelessness sector and in the surrounding sectors and the rural sector, of course, as well. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing now and welcome everybody back to see if we've got any questions.
Thank you so much, Elise, Amy, Lucy, and Eva for this excellent presentation and sharing with us how DAHA accreditation matters and why is it so valuable. And the accreditation covers all the issues and challenges many organizations across Europe are facing when it comes to integrating domestic abuse support or response into homelessness services. So thank you so much for sharing that, how like a shared framework can help organization. And it was also great to see, and I think it's a great example of a whole organization approach that is needed. So thank you so much. we already had a few questions relating to sharing the recordings and the presentation and the slides. So there's definitely interest in these resources. So we will post the recordings and the presentation on the FANSA website, and I will be also sharing them with all participants as well. And we had a question about standards in developing standards in a mixed environment, where the perpetrator is also a service user. Who would like to respond first to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that, and then I'm sure Amy and Elise might have something to share as well. So yeah, we've got a few bits of guidance that might be useful. So we did a piece of work about 5 years ago now called Confidence and Complexity, and that's a very practical piece of guidance for frontline workers who might be in hostels or doing outreach. About how to work when, the perpetrator is also a service user, and maybe the perpetrator and the survivor are often together, so it's hard to have those kind of safe conversations. That's available online. I can send that. Maybe, Dalma, if I send you the link to that and maybe you could circulate it, that might be the easiest thing.
Actually, we did a webinar already 5 years ago on that topic, so I'm happy to share the recording as well and the resources. Yeah. Yes.
Great. And then Amy, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the kind of perpetrator-specific guidance that the working group developed.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. So another piece of guidance that we worked on, so it was us at DAHA, Lucy at SHP, as well as some other colleagues across the sector from other homelessness organisations, and also our specialist perpetrator services in England as well. Pulled together some guidance a couple of years ago, specifically focusing on how to support perpetrators who are residing in housing first and supported accommodation services. And it's 3 parts. So it's 1 part for supported accommodation providers directly, 1 for commissioners, and also includes a case study from a couple, I think it's from a couple housed together in Camden, I believe, is also part of that guidance as well. So we can, I'll send you the links to those, Dalma, and they can be shared. They have practical tips, as I say, for frontline professionals, but also for commissioners as well. So kind of both sides of that really. So we can share them if they would be helpful.
Yeah, and also last year it's not for perpetrators in mixed environments, but we did this research about developing a model for a couple's housing first. But as part of that, we created standards about how to work safely in the scenario that the survivor and perpetrator are still in a relationship and want to be housed together. And actually the standards are really applicable to so how you would work, whether that was in a kind of a mixed hostel environment or if you're trying to get them independent accommodation, because it's about kind of how you do the work and what underpins it in terms of standards. So that might be an interesting one to have a read of as well. And that was informed by, actually all of these pieces of work were informed by lots and lots of survivor consultation, speaking to the survivors that had actually been through all of this and asking them what would have helped, what they would have wanted. And we actually spoke to some perpetrators of domestic abuse who'd been homeless too, obviously very carefully and not in the context of, you know, making it known that we knew they were perpetrators, but their insights and experiences were also very interesting in this piece of research. So yeah, happy to share that as well if it's helpful.
Great, thank you. I'm checking also the chat box if we have any more questions. Yes, I think we do. To what extent do you have awareness cooperated into your programs? This is here the perspective among the homeless, that the homeless system is there to control them. How do you deal with the law enforcement agencies who are the perpetrators of violence against homeless individuals?
I can't actually see the question, but this is about law enforcement and how we work with them, right? Yeah. This is a really interesting and a very timely one, because actually we have had some challenges in the last couple of weeks with law enforcement taking quite a negative and quite a victim blaming view of some of the survivors that we're working with in our Housing First project, and where there's been domestic abuse perpetrated against them, law enforcement have been just, very much on the side of, oh, this is antisocial behaviour, penalising the survivor, all the things that are wrong. How we go about that is just to continuously challenge. So we do everything we do in partnership with a whole range of other services: law enforcement, substance use, mental health, social services, all of the ones that you might imagine. And I suppose part of the work is regularly bringing together those cross-sector networks and having challenging conversations and working through disagreement and working to try to educate law enforcement sometimes about what trauma responses can look like for women experiencing multiple disadvantage, and how she's not angry and aggressive, she's terrified and frightened for her life, for example. So it's really a real challenge, and it's a work in progress, and I think we're doing that every day. But I think we do slowly see change over time by, instead of trying to kind of work separately from law enforcement, we try to step towards them and we try to bring them in and educate and work together and see if we can kind of have a bit more common ground. But yeah, I really appreciate it's hard for all of us, I think. I don't know if anyone's got anything else on that.
Yeah, obviously echo everything that Lucy says. I'm just reading the kind of first part of the question, and I hope I'm interpreting this correctly, but the bit that stood out to me, as well as about the homelessness system trying to control people. And I think from our perspective, our DAHA perspective, where we don't work frontline, so we don't directly support the individuals who are being supported by the homelessness system, but as I say, we had experience of it, we understand what the issues kind of are. And I think one of the things that we try to kind of embed within our framework of standards is that, of course, it can be very difficult to support survivors of domestic abuse who may not have trust in services, not just the police, but other services as well, whether it's the housing team at the local authority who they might feel let down by, or services that they've maybe accessed in the past that maybe didn't work for them very well, or didn't meet their needs properly. And I think we try to support frontline staff to understand why it's difficult and why maybe survivors aren't going to trust them straight away, and to have patience with the people that they're trying to support, and recognize that it is really difficult, because we, as much as we wish we could, we can't change the whole system, and there are kind of issues, and as Lucy says, we need to try and work alongside the systems and raise awareness and educate those who maybe aren't supporting this cohort of survivors correctly. So I think there is also a part to play from our perspective, that we are working with professionals to so that they know that it's an uphill battle, and the trust can be broken quite quickly, and they need to have patience and understanding and understand why it's so hard for survivors to trust that we are going to do right by them, because obviously that there are good people out there doing great work, but when they've been let down, it can be really tricky to let those individuals in. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah, that's what my thoughts really.
Thank you, Amy. We are running a bit out of time, but we have two last questions. One about data protection and privacy rules, and the other one is the Housing First and working with the perpetrators in abusive relationship.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one from Alvaro, and I would say do have a read of the research project on this, because it's very much in depth, all about the question that you've just asked, and there is no quick answer. But very quickly, what we found was that it was almost impossible to manage in supported accommodation situations, and there's a case study that Amy mentioned as part of that guidance, because even if we're trying to prioritize what the survivor wanted in supported accommodation, okay, so there'd be a violent incident, police would be called, support put there for the survivor. But then the survivor would say, please don't kick my partner out. I want him to be here with me. But obviously the impact on staff, the impact on other clients, you can't be turning the other way or seem to be condoning domestic abuse by allowing this person to be violent and then continue to live in the supported accommodation. So what would often happen would be the perpetrator would then be evicted if it was a kind of a certain level of violence or abuse, and then the survivor would leave and go and follow and rough sleep with that person. So it was really impossible. This is why we developed the couples housing first model, where they get separate but concurrent properties at a distance from each other, which is decided by the survivor. So maybe she says, it feels safe for me to maybe be 1 kilometre away, we can spend time at each other's properties, but if an incident happens, neither of them end up losing the accommodation. So that was the thinking behind that. But it's a really good question. But ultimately in our study, what we concluded was our first principle was the survivor's choice, control and autonomy must always kind of guide all of the decisions that we make, because when we try to separate people, when we try to do things to people, it doesn't help to reduce domestic abuse. In fact, it can actually push that couple further away, and it doesn't work well for anybody. But yeah, a really interesting question that deserves a whole conversation, I think, on that one, Alvaro.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think we'll definitely organize a webinar on that topic. Anyone would like to comment on the data protection and privacy rules? The question from Friederike. How do you handle cooperation among services with regards to data protection and privacy rules?
I can try and answer this one. Data protection is definitely not my strong point, but obviously we need to have a basic understanding of it in the work that we do. I would say for the most part it's standard practice across frontline services that we have information sharing agreements to allow for the safe sharing of confidential information in a secure way. So I think that is something that we overall, I think, probably do quite well across the sector. In terms of this piece of work specifically, I think some maybe areas that we maybe see come up sometimes, we might see that maybe where there aren't information sharing agreements put in place, that services are understandably hesitant to share information, even if sharing that information will reduce risk of harm, or not sharing the information might increase risk. And that is an issue that we are aware of and do try to actively work with providers to reduce, really. So I think within, I suppose, from our framework perspective, we have standards and guidance in there around making sure that there are information sharing agreements in place to prevent that. And that if there are kind of concerns, we can talk to the providers involved to make sure that there is the option for safe data sharing. I'm not sure I can say much more than that. I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to come in on that one, Paul.
I was just going to add that whilst obviously we really support survivor-led data sharing and information sharing as well, we also speak to our providers around sort of safeguarding protocols and how sometimes, whilst we're always proportionate with data sharing and information sharing, it's about talking to survivors in your services about the fact that there might be some scenarios or some situations that have occurred that override consent. This is in the UK, we're looking at circumstances where there's really high risk of injury or death or other high risk situations where we have an obligation to share information with other agencies. So as Amy said, it's really tricky, but it is really important when you're working with survivors and perpetrators to be really confident in information sharing, and knowing that, as Amy's already said, often information sharing is a life-saving tool that I think sometimes we need to reframe how we look at information sharing.
Yeah, and I think very practically, you know, most of the people that we support who experience homelessness, they do have poor health, they do have involvement with substance use services, they're quite used to having different organisations and workers involved in their care. And when we start working with them, how we explain it to them was, if they let us speak to those agencies and coordinate things on their behalf, we can work for them, we can get them the outcomes we want. And actually most people throughout my work experience have not felt that that's something that they're not up for doing. Obviously, as Elise said, in certain circumstances we would override that anyway if there's a risk, but the majority of people that we support, I think, want us to be working on their behalf and coordinating those agencies, because actually we can get better outcomes for them, and they do tend to be understanding of that. So they'll just sign to say, yes, you can share appropriate information in a safe way with these partner agencies, and then we can do the work collaboratively.
Thank you. I think our webinar is coming to an end. I just would like to thank everyone for joining today. We'll definitely continue this conversation because this approach is definitely has relevance across Europe. And there's also, I took notes, and lots of issues to follow up, among them like the work with the perpetrators. We haven't had time to cover the staff support needs, which is very important, especially in light of the survey that you mentioned, with a high percentage of staff disclosing experience of domestic abuse. So we'll come back to you with the new webinars next year as well. And just a reminder, but I'm sure everyone is already preparing for the 16 days of activism, which will be launched in a week. And FANS also joins this campaign, so please follow our social media. Thank you again for Elise, Amy, Eva, and Lucy for their excellent contribution this morning. And I wish everyone a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.